So a couple things have happened since we last covered the party's actions. First and foremost, the party did finally finish their trek going through the plantation. There was... So, to rehash this, because to be 100% honest, I don't remember how much of this we talked about in the previous story thus far, since from my perspective it's been close to 2 months since I recorded that. What happened is the party entered the plantation area and found several creatures that they determined were used to be people that had been exposed to something. They're not even sure what. And that something has enabled those creatures to function as living weapons, including literal suicide bombs. Basically, the way they work is they fight, and if they are killed, they explode immediately, which then destroys whatever's nearby them. Hence getting the best of both worlds. They are serving you coming and going. Now, the party never figured out who exactly was behind this. Now, what's interesting is some information was unveiled in there that implicated Abilene, our relatively recent party member, as a member of the Pinnacle, and showcasing that the Pinnacle was behind this. Now, this is interesting for two reasons, because number one, this is falsified information, haha, but number two, because Abilene herself saw this and decided to sneak it away, a little sleight of hand, and got rid of it and decided she was not going to present it to the rest of the party because she did not want that kind of thing to be taken the wrong way. That would obviously be a very, very dangerous situation for her, appropriately enough. Now, after having done all this, they decided they finally needed a night rest, and we're just, oh god, we need to get some sleep. Turns out the local innkeeper was actually stockpiling a large amount of meat. Now, you probably don't remember this, but the town was in a bit of a food shortage situation. So the fact that the local innkeeper was stockpiling meat in order to be able to parcel it up bit by bit was not really legal and not really moral, but the party decided to go ahead and go with it because they basically dumped, mostly Guido actually, dumped a large amount of money on the innkeeper saying, here you go, open up the stocks. And a lot of food and drink was provided both for the party and for just the populace in general. Much merriment was going around, and a lot of booze. And I mean a lot of booze. They actually had real Lugian alcohol now. Now, if you don't remember, Lugian alcohol is extremely caustic to the point where it can literally, physically burn your tongue, as in burn holes through your tongue. Unless you happen to be a Lugian, or an ogre, or a couple of other races that can endure that kind of thing. Trolls come to mind. And if you're paying attention, a lot of those races tend to be around this area. That's why they'd keep that on stock. So Guido got to enjoy some real Lugian booze for a bit. That was nice. When they woke up the next morning, both Snarg and Guido had these strange crystals kind of affixed to them. And they weren't really sure what to make of them. They pulled them right off and were like, hmm? They didn't reaffix. You know, once they pulled them off, they were separate. So they're like, I don't even know what to do with this exactly. Okay, whatever. They didn't do any extensive tests on it. They did try to look into it. Near as they can tell, these are basically casting crystals. Now, this is something that hasn't really come up in the campaign before, but effectively you can imbue a single-use spell or magic effect into a gem. And the different types of gems have different effects based on this. I'm not going to bore you with all the details. But once you do that, you literally crush the gem, and then in so doing, the spell goes off. And there's a couple of little side details that make that a little more malleable. For example, obviously crushing a diamond would be a difficult thing to do with your bare hand, but the will to crush it that goes through your soul into the gem actually is what causes it to disintegrate. So it's basically an on-use item, even in lore. So they decided, for some reason, not to use these mysterious gems that had just appeared. However, Guido decided, as a point of curiosity, to use his particular form of rubber band teleportation, and in so doing, the crystals multiplied, and so he now had several of the same crystal. He's got like 12 or so, I think, at this point, because he did this a couple of times. So, having dealt with this situation, the party decides, well, it's about time to finally make our way to Eldritch, which is the capital of the Order. And they naturally decide to go to Zykal to do this. This is a good moment to admit that it's my fault that they did that. See, here's the thing. Everything that's labeled as a major city on the world map, well, let's just say there's two definitions of the words major city. There's a major city as in this is a hub and a capital of a region or a province or a state or whatever. And then there's a major city, as in this was a place that was founded by the Scions and has certain functions that the Scions built into them. The two most important being the adaptive walls, which I've discussed before, and the hub, which is the interlinking teleportation network. So Zykal was founded by a Banderling within the last century or so, and therefore is not a psionic town, and therefore does not have a hub or a malleable wall thing. The reason I say this is my fault is that they were trying to sell each other. Basically, Abilene was trying to sell the other two on going here, because that way they could use the hub to teleport directly to Eldritch. No hub. Whoops. They decided to go to Zykal anyways. I fessed up and was like, I'm sorry, guys. I screwed up. It's okay, though, because they got some good work done. We spent an entire session basically playing politics, which I actually enjoyed very much, and I talked to the players afterwards, and they enjoyed it too. I shouldn't say politics, that's not quite accurate. It's more like the players were spending the whole time prepping and getting stuff done. You know, it's like, okay, we've got this mission, let's prep for it. So they, you know, sold a bunch of stuff in town, bought new items, repaired certain parts of their gear, you know, that usual kind of shopping trip excursion that most RPGs have. On top of that, though, they also pooled the resources a little bit and got a caravan going. See, here's what happened. Guido, who of course has his company, Iseer Shipping, which has been slowly expanding its operations throughout the entire continent, actually, at this point, wanted to get a trade lane going up here between Zykal and Fox Ridge. Now, that's a heck of a trip. That's several days of a trip on hard terrain. So he got the most... I gave him lots and lots of options, basically. It's like, you can get this kind of caravan, you can get a caravan that has wagons, or a caravan that's just people, or, you know, all this stuff. Basically, the only thing that wasn't available was a full-on airship. Or a land ship, since most people don't even know those exist. He decided to go for a fairly expensive, fairly experienced caravaner, and got his whole group, which contained a large number of both macro-scale cargo wagons, as well as smaller, more personal wagons. And then, ironically, he then coordinated with Snarg in order to provide the defense. See, Snarg, for his part, has been expanding his operations for Blood Fox, which is his personal private military company that he has been pushing for some time. He already has several elites in charge of it, and a fairly large base of troops, I don't know what else to call them at that point, and specialists. So he goes around town hiring up as many people as he can in order to serve as the troops who will actually guard this caravan, and basically loans them out for free to Guido in order to guard his thing. So the two of them get this joint thing going together, and it was a ton of fun setting it up and doing all that fun stuff. Finally, one of the things that they are shipping, to draw all three players into this, so Abilene had some loot that consisted of something like 30 or so suits of iron gear, as in swords and armor and helmets and all that fun stuff. So she basically put those into the wagon so those could be carried to Fox Ridge, so those can be used to equip Snarg's troops, and that wagon is being run by Guido, and the wagon is being protected by Snarg. At least politically. You get the point. So it was a nice, fun session. And we spent considerable time setting this up and buying a few things in town. All that fun stuff. Eventually, however, the party was like, we need to get to Eldritch. So they decide, we're going to go ahead and spring for an airship. They decide to go ahead and buy a cheap super transport. Now, that's actually the wrong term. Basically, a speedy transport. In other words, it's small, it's fast, and it's super uncomfortable. It's a ship that's basically a set of engines with a cockpit. And so the three of them barely fit in there. And zoom! And it only took them 2 days to get to Eldritch from that point. 2 days of being cramped and uncomfortable and generally miserable. But that's what they voted for. They get there. Now, I'm going to do my best to describe Eldritch for you. Eldritch is, of course, the capital of the Order of Summoners, and it has been there since year 0 at the very least. Now, Eldritch is one solid chunk of material. What I mean by that is if you were to picture in your mind for a moment a model of a city, like that's one cohesive unit, you know, everything's glued together or whatever, and you pick up the model and you just put it down on a flat piece of terrain, That's kind of what Eldritch is. The whole city was carved from a single chunk of material that was kind of fused and has a lot of weaving keeping the thing together. No one's entirely certain who crafted it and how, but the whole thing is, of course, in the shape of an octagon, as you might imagine. And there are spires and pillars. It's very crystalline in its overall approach, somewhat Egyptian with a little bit of Sumerian, if you happen to know what that looks like. And if you don't, it's got lots of jagged angles, lots of sharp corners, and of course the number 8 is present in almost every aspect of the architecture. Similarly, there are veins of gemstone that run through it. For example, if you could imagine for a moment like a solid wall of marble, and then there's an indent, like a square indent into it that runs in a line, kind of like the trench on the Death Star. I know that's a weird parallel, but I'm trying to think of something else that looks like this, okay? But instead of just the empty trench, that trench is filled with gemstone, like a solid line of it, which in terms of value is ridiculously expensive, yes. And each of the 8 quadrants has one of the gemstones corresponding with that element. Now, I don't remember what those are off the top of my head, and those notes are over there. Just trust me when I say that I looked it. I figured it all out. The overall design of the place is very much inclined towards places of study, places of self-reflection, and large open spaces. There's not a lot of real city feeling to Eldritch, even though it is a massive area. And there is some city that's built up on the outer edges of the single concrete block, which is built up over the centuries in order to support, you know, the populace and the trade people and the people who support them and the cooks and the cleaners and the schoolers and just all the aspects of society that have built up around Eldritch that exists on the outside. In the inside, it's almost entirely just members of the Order themselves. The very center of Eldritch is a massive pseudo-pyramid. So what it is if you can imagine the 4 spokes of a pyramid coming up like this, and then it terminates and plateaus rather than going all the way to a peak. You with me so far? And at each of these spokes, there's like a spike that continues going up past that peak and terminates in a sharp edge. And then in the middle of that plateau is a tall pillar which goes straight up and terminates in a massive statue. I shouldn't say massive, it's only like 30 feet tall. But this statue is carved from sheer jade, and this statue is of the Boy Emperor. So they learn a little bit more about the history of the Order while they're here, which I'm going to share with you, of course. I'm going to give you a little bit of the abridged version. So what is known is that the Order originally was a group of individuals that got together to before Year Zero, and they were studiers of both the elementalism, the elemental ley lines, and summoning in general. And a certain individual whose name has been lost to history rose up and tried to usurp control of the Order and use it as a political movement, and became a very horrible dictator. The stories about this man are just absolutely atrocious. The kind of atrocities and violence he imposed on other people was significant. This is the kind of person who would think nothing about killing someone because they didn't kneel immediately in his presence. So he took power, and a young boy who was an immensely skilled summoner, so powerful that he was probably the strongest green mage of his era, rose up and started opposing this guy. Now here's the thing. The history books make it clear that even though this Boy Emperor is called that, he never really actually led the revolution against the usurper. Because the idea, or not the usurper, the opposer, excuse me, the dictator, the tyrant. Because he was just a symbol. But because he was so powerful, he could fight one-on-one against the Order's forces, and he provided hope for the actual political movements to organize and form an actual military and then oppose this dictator, this tyrant, bring him down and killed him. Now, the Boy Emperor then sought to use his newfound influence as basically this leader, hero, king figure. That's where the term Boy Emperor comes from, by the way. They started referring to him as that after this incident, to unify the Order into this new organization which has endured ever since into the modern era, which is far more about study, aid, and support. Hence the 3 general wings of the Order. Study of the elements, support for and aid for people, and of course the 3rd wing, which deals with trying to prevent hostile forces from causing harm, throughout the course of the continent. Make sense? So that's just a little bit of backstory on the Order that I haven't really gotten into yet. Now, they go, and this was kind of a weird session to do because a lot of it had to be done by phone. Once upon a time, back when I used to GM, in person with people, the way this would actually have worked is I would be, it's a sidebar. I used to do this all the time. It's like, all right, sis, sidebar. And we'd wander outside or we'd wander into another room and we'd chat quietly and then we'd come back. And then I'd be like, you, sidebar. And so we just kind of use text messages in order to supplement the absence of a sidebar in this case. So Abilene, of course, reports in to her Order leaders, and she has given new orders to stick to Guido like glue. I'm not going to tell you the full extent of those orders, but I am going to tell you that the reasoning given is that they believe that Guido might be the answer that they have been searching for all this time in order to help save the continent from itself. So they impress upon Abilene that this is a critically important thing, massively, severely important thing, and this is to be her top priority. She's also to aid Guido, not only to... She is effectively functioning as his bodyguard at this point, as well as continuing to report on his actions to the Order. They also find a young woman who... I'm forgetting her name for the second time in the same day. She is an expert arc weaver. And she is a strange kind of a person who is very enthusiastic, but doesn't show an inch of it. Like, she will talk in this drained monotone, but she is super exuberant about what she actually cares about and will throw her all into sort of things. She is, as I said, an arc weaver. She's probably, I'd say, the third best weaver the party has encountered thus far. Not counting people that the party isn't aware of that they've encountered, because there's better. And she is basically reassigned to the party because she has discovered a device which enables her to do a function I've been wanting to do for a while now. But because of my own self-adherence to it has to make sense in lore, I haven't been able to introduce this to the party in character yet. So she has a device which can, to use World of Warcraft terms, disenchant equipment. So they can feed any of the loot they gain that they don't want just into this rather than turn it into gold. And in so doing, she will get resource. And this resource can then be converted into making new, custom woven gear. Now, she still has to do a weaving roll, but because of this resource, they now have the ability to not only make better woven gear than normally would be allowed, because weaving is by definition very restrictive for balancing reasons. This bypasses that. In other words, they can make gear at their level, as opposed to being limited to what most weavers can make. But in addition to that, she doesn't have to burn her own CXP in order to actually do so. So the party now has the ability to craft custom weapons, finally. Weapons, armor, equipment. I mean, the rut. They have the ability to fully access weaving. All they need is the raw magical materials, aka previously woven items which can be fed into the device. Make sense? So that was awesome. Sorry, I'm having trouble breathing today. It's the weather. Forgive me. So, having done so, the party is then... I'm sorry. Let me give you a little bit of an out-of-character perspective. I don't have much else to say, so this is going to chop off pretty soon here. But I want to give you a little bit of an out-of-character perspective. So, when I originally formed Primus, over the course of like a year and a half, it was designed so there were layers of conflict. And tiers to those layers. So obviously a war between the mundane races was something that was bred into it and made likely to happen very early on. I put lots of hints of that into my earlier episodes. Shortly thereafter that, though, it became clear that there were other people pulling strings behind the scenes, and those people were the ones who were actually going to war with each other. Then there were people who were much stronger than those people who weren't yet at war, but were ideologically opposed to each other, at least on a not on a fundamental, but on a surface level. And then there's other stuff we haven't even gotten to yet, that we can still keep going up from here, trust me. So the idea, based on... Now, all of this is placed on player interaction, too. I don't want to just tell the players, yeah, you've been doing this for 20 sessions, but this is happening now. I don't like doing that. While I always ascribe to the idea as a GM that the world keeps moving without you, I also ascribe to the idea that the world reacts to you. So in other words, the players can help shape the story on a large scale, on a macro scale, not just on a micro scale, okay? Now, I'm not going to list all the things that the players have been doing for the last many, many sessions, but let's just say between what Zeiss and Coulson were doing, between what Rory, Hagaidy, and Javan were doing, between what Zerial was doing, and Kazrinthka to an extent, and between what Abilene, Guido, and Snarg were doing, events started going in a direction that I completely didn't anticipate. But the problem is, and I blame my sister for picking up on this, I tend to write most of my villains intelligently. So they tend to be reasonable and willing to listen to reason, which means you can, diplomatize with them and work things out with them. I never expected anyone to try. So what happens as a result of all the players' interactions is... I'm sorry, I'm still blown away by this. Let me lay out what was supposed to happen. So the High Queen Alyssa is the one who basically helped found the Eluvian Kingdom, okay? I've talked about the whole politics of that and the foundation of that over in my concerning Primus videos, which aren't discontinued so much as I haven't had time for them, in case you're wondering why this hasn't been happening. Anyways, so she's an individual who is both personally and politically extremely powerful, very popular with the people, and very well positioned, okay? So, she is someone who basically walked away from the political scenes and handed power to the lords on purpose, but recently came back. And thanks to some of her interactions and the interactions of the players, she ended up with the 11 backing her. Now, I wouldn't even be surprised if most of you don't even remember the 11. And that's okay. I'm not going to describe them in full here because, let's be honest, most of the players don't know who the 11 are either. But the 11 are now fully backing her, and she had a whole plan of action to basically completely revitalize the Kingdom of Eluvia, and to send an army of unholy doom against the forces of what is now known as the Dominion, the Director and the Viocians, okay? The Dominion, of course, consists of the Viocians, which are, I think we've given it away at this point, used to be humans once upon a time, but are now not. I mean, they are. Their souls are humans, but their bodies definitely aren't. And function as fully mechanical entities who also have a tremendous amount of power and influence with regards to the entire continent and access to extremely advanced technology. We're talking Star Trek level of technology are in these guys' hands. They're just a little limited in every other aspect. And the Directorate, which was an organization founded by the Lord Rytheron, who is a former Scion but now is a Dericost, and has decided that for the betterment of these people, the Scions should just rule them in order to stop all this squabbling and infighting and to just make it so that people can live and be prosperous. Now, the Viocians were also interested in unifying the people in order to stop the squabbling and blah, 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 partially because, and I don't want to get too much into this because this has not been revealed yet, but something happened to make the Viocians so limited. There's a reason the Viocians haven't won yet. And that reason is one of the reasons why he is very strongly interested in trying to unify people for their own good, rather than allowing them to do horrible things. The High Queen Alyssa, if you're paying attention, wants to unify the kingdom for... You see where this is going here, right? So what was intended to happen was while the party was in Eldritch, neutral ground, the big war would be declared between what is now the hegemony of Eluvia and the Dominion. And thanks to the help of the 11, Eluvia would actually be an even match in that fight. But this would be much, much more devastating than the war has already been. And I say that, I'm hardly can even believe that myself, because I know exactly how devastating the war has been. Basically, picture the difference between World War I and World War II in terms of scale, I think is the best way to put that. Because while World War I was absolutely horrible, a lot of that was fairly self-contained to certain areas of Europe, mostly, and was on a much more personal level. You know, individuals suffering and dying. In the World War II example here, well, let's just say that we would probably see several more craters happen and more continent shifting, and yeah, it would be pretty devastating. But that's not what happened. As a result, again, of player interaction, most notably Coulson, Zeiss, and Zerial are probably the biggest movers on this one, the High Queen Alyssa was approached, and then, in so doing, decided to approach the leaders of the Dominion. That would be the Lord Rytherin and a gentleman named Primarch, who hasn't really had a lot of screen time yet. He's the leader of the Vyotians. And yes, that's his name, not his title. So Primarch, Rytherin, and Alyssa all got together in a room and unified. So the superpower of the Dominion, it's still being called the Dominion, it's just the Dominion also now includes all of Alluvia and the ridiculous amount of wealth of resources and land it has, as well as its huge population boon, and of course the backing of the 11. And in addition to this, the Dominion also now basically controls all of the Stoneholders, since basically all of the Stoneholders were either already in their territory in Stonehold, or were part of Alluvia, which is now part of the Dominion. The name of the episode where this happened, I titled Changing the World, because this blew me away. And I'm just going to go ahead and tell you something now, even though this happens in the next session after this. What is going to end up happening, because it's kind of off camera, is there's been a civil war in the show Empire for like months at this point. And Sethos, who was a former player, has been spearheading a lot of that on behalf of one of the sides, the Alterationists. The Alterationists have been very much in favor of a complete reform of the government and moving away from the other side, which is the Traditionalists, whose platform you could probably guess by their name. They just want things to stay as they are because the way things are have worked for 3.5 centuries. The show Empire being the oldest organization in the setting. Or, well, oldest of the 5 nations anyways. So, there's been a civil war, but it's been a show civil war. No fighting has happened. No physical fighting. No violence, no death. It is a war of politics. It's a war of perception. It's a war of opinion and populace. And the thing is, the Alterationists have been super underwhelming in that. They probably would have lost within days, if not for the fact that someone was feeding them political favors, resources, and information, and just plain money, in order to help fund them and keep them functional so the Alterationists could match up to the Traditionalists. That someone is Lord Farron of Silent Blade. Probably my favorite NPC in this setting. I feel like I've mentioned him before, but in case I haven't, he is the Lord of Glendon Wood. I like to think of him as the smartest villain I've created in this setting, because he is very, very smart. And he likes to think very far ahead, and even though he doesn't have the power to, reshape your mind with his hands, he has the power to do much worse to you with the massive political backing behind him. If I may quote Coulson here, there was a scene where Coulson, the character, actually was in a personal interview with Lord Farron of Silent Blade, and he mentions that he was terrified the whole time. And I thought that was awesome because it meant that I was doing my job properly, because Lord Farron of Silent Blade is a terrifying individual, or at least he should be. He's kind of the Arcturus Mensk of this setting, if you follow me. Anyways, so Lord Farron of Silent Blade has been funding the Alterationists for months. In the wake of the new Dominion thing that happens over the course of the next month, he decides to reposition himself entirely. He actually had a side plot that I think only Coulson and Zeiss ever saw the hints of. They never really figured out anything about him personally, that I'm aware. Where he was going to usurp and take over Alluvia by popular opinion. As in, he was the way it was going to work, the people were going to demand that he become the new High King of Alluvia. And he was very well in favor of that, or very well along in that plot. What ends up happening, though, is because of this whole Dominion thing, he immediately reshifts his position, still has tremendous popular support. He throws his lot in with the Dominion as well, which means the populace is now in favor of the Dominion, as well as making sure that he is politically now connected with the remainder of the Dominion, including his fellow Alluvians in the Lordship and the High Queen. Then he uses his newfound influence to pull even more strings and more resources than he had access to before in the favor of the Alterationists. In so doing, he pretty much single-handedly secures an Alterationist win. So the Alterationists actually have won the Civil War, and they are now supremely indebted to Lord Farron of Silent Blade, as is the Dominion, because the very next thing that happens is he negotiates the new show, I actually can't remember the name right now, but the new show organization as a member state of the Dominion. So he is now probably the most politically powerful individual in the Dominion, which now includes every single nation on the continent, with 3 exceptions. The Olthoi, the Order, although that's getting debatable, and the Osteth Republic. And that's it. Yeah, I didn't see that one coming. I gotta be honest. Over the next session, we're going to be doing a couple of time skips. You can feel free to watch those, and of course, I'll summarize them in the next story this far. And then, of course, we'll see what we make of this new world that the players have made. Otherwise, I'll see you next time, guys.